What do you think?
I think we're dead meat. Real dead meat.
You're dead meat! Go ahead and laugh, you guys. If I ever find a little bastards that did this, they're dead meat.
Welcome to the Dead Meat Podcast, an extension of the YouTube channel Dead Meat. I'm James.
I'm Chelsea, and we're a boyfriend and girlfriend, and we like to get scared together. And you may be, let's see if this is the day this comes out, you might be wondering, what is this? This isn't a kill count.
It's not a kill count. Nope.
So this is the first time that we're doing the podcast to be the same movie as the kill count. We haven't done this before, so this is kind of an experiment, I guess. Mostly because you're doing Texas Chainsaw, the series.
Yes, if you're watching this when this comes out, then the kill count for Texas Chainsaw is out tomorrow, Friday.
Yeah, and I wanted to get in on it because Texas Chainsaw is my favorite horror movie. I adore it. I think it's perfect. And I wanted to be able to, one, talk about it, too, and also, two, you wanted to be able to go on more of a deep dive of this movie.
Yeah, because when you watch this movie, there are so many different ways to read it, from its situation historically with Vietnam going on to just, down to like the livestock and the way meat is processed. Like, that's a whole reading in and of itself. I can't get into that in a kill count. Kill count is there for like, I get my jokes in. I get some behind the scenes stuff in. So.
Yeah, that we won't be talking about, really. The making of it, we're not going to be talking about that at all. This is going to be a deep dive into the meaning of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the subtext, the what it's really about stuff.
Yeah.
Because this movie's really, really layered, and it's done so on purpose. It's a layered script. I think just because it's written so well, it seems very simple on its surface. Mm-hmm. It really, really does. And I think maybe people who look at analysis of it and think it's maybe a little too much, maybe you're thinking, what is there to analyze here? I'm just reading too much into it because it's my favorite horror. But there's so much scholarly work about this movie, to the point that this took me so long to research. I had to push the podcast 2 days.
Yeah.
Because I was doing so much reading, and I'll kind of shout out my sources as we're going along. There's one cat hair just right. It keeps hitting my nose. It's very irritating. But yeah, you want to just jump in?
Let's
got a lot to cover.
Let's cover this beast.
Well, I want to talk about first the 1970s as kind of a golden age of horror. In my opinion, it is. I wouldn't say it's objectively the best, but I would say it's a golden age of horror.
Sure.
There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. It's my favorite time period. This is when horror starts to get really violent, really graphic. It's gritty and gross, and it's not fantastical anymore. I think before this, horror is still a bit more fantasy. But then in the 70s, you get this and Last House on the Left and stuff like it, where it feels like you're watching something you shouldn't be watching. This is, even to play that up more so, Texas Chainsaw says it's based on a true story. So you get the feeling you're maybe watching a documentary or something. And the other interesting thing about Texas Chainsaw is it's associated with this era that's super gory and graphic, but this movie, people misremember it as being so much gorier than it actually is. You don't see that much blood.
There's hardly anything.
Everything is implied, and we're going to make a lot of parallels between this and Psycho. One, because they're based off the same source material, and two, their famous scenes, Psycho is because of the way it's edited and staged, people came away from that thinking, oh my God, I just saw something so incredibly violent, but you don't really see anything. And that's the same with this. It's all cuts and editing and framing and sound design. And you just kind of imagine, not to say that it's not very disturbing. I think the horror of this movie, and this movie is still truly scary. We just watched it, and we watched it with a bunch of friends who'd never seen it before, and everyone came away from that feeling like cool, I'm gonna go shower now.
Yeah, it's great.
It was great. Yes, if you want to, traumatize your friends, Texas Chainsaw is like a good
Definitely.
choice. Because you technically didn't even show them anything that fucked up. They imagined it. Yeah, everything about it's gross, and then on top of it, it offers you zero catharsis. The end of this is not a happy ending, I don't think. Like, sure, our final girl, our main character, Sally, gets away, but does she really?
Hey, she's looking pretty messed up there psychologically at the end.
Yeah. So this chaos and the grossness of this movie makes sense coming out of the 70s, because the 70s in both the US and around the world it's just pure chaos. We're coming out of the late 1960s where there's a giant like upheaval in general, just socially, culturally, and the 70s in that time must have really felt like an apocalypse in action, or feeling like the world, I think, truly felt like it was going to end, because it just seemed like there was no shortage of terrible news. And that's, because we have the worst economy worldwide since the Great Depression. We're coming off the 1950s where everything's awesome. And those are the good old days. Everything's, yes, economically.
Yeah.
Everything is pretty great. Not so much in other respects, but we have our post-World War II economy, so many jobs, everything is just squeaky clean on the surface.
Which, again, we've said before, it's because the rest of the world was still fucked up, man.
That's right. Yeah, Europe especially is just fucked. So
pretty easy to be a economic powerhouse when your country's the only one left intact after a world war.
Yeah, exactly. So then we get the 70s where we have this giant economic crash, and crime in major cities is at an all-time high, which that's why you get movies like Death Wish. We just talked about Death Wish, where it's this kind of wish fulfillment vigilante movie where it's a guy just killing criminals in the big city. And then we got real life. Son of Sam is in 1976, and he's a serial murderer who shot a bunch of people in New York City. And it's news, like it's this constant barrage of news like that's just making people go nuts. It's scary. And we're getting to the end of the Vietnam War. Most Americans now are finally opposed to it. And
because they've been seeing it on their TVs.
Exactly. We have TV. Nixon promises to end the war, but instead bombs Cambodia. Thanks, Henry Kissinger. By the way, I just kept thinking about this while I was researching that Henry Kissinger is still alive, and Toby Hooper's not.
Nope.
How old is Kissinger? He's like 93.
He's definitely in his 90s.
Something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He's in that Theranos documentary that HBO did, if you want some...
Okay.
I didn't realize he was kind of a big player in that company, but...
I just imagine he has his fingers in everything.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Nobel Peace Prize winner, Henry Kissinger.
That's right. Yeah. So basically the shine of America's worn off in the 70s. We've got our nasty underbelly is kind of exposed, and so appropriately, Toby Hooper and Kim Henkel's Texas in this is a wasteland. It's like this a post-apocalyptic wasteland with dying cows and abandoned gas stations, dug up graves and decaying mansions, and then obviously our farmhouse full of cannibals. But yeah, like I was saying before, this movie's been interpreted over and over and over again by academics, and I like this quote a lot by John Towlson, who wrote Subversive Horror Cinema, if you want to read it.
Texas Chainsaw has been variously interpreted by academics as an inverted fairy tale, an example of apocalyptic art, an allegory of Vietnam, and a metaphor for rampant consumerism and economic meltdown in a late capitalist society. That the film yields to such a variety of interpretations, which are by no means contradictory readings, speaks to the density of its text.
So yeah, this movie has been analyzed over and over and over again, and there's so many different readings of this film, and I'm gonna try and give my one pretty cohesive reading, I think, from these sources that I've used. I've put together one, I think, take on it that makes all these theories make sense.
Ooh, is this the Chelsea Rebecca unified theory of Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
Oh man, we can call it that if we want to. But you might think I didn't, explore something as deeply as you would have wanted to, or you have a totally different take on it. And that's valid, because this movie, there's so many different takes on it, which is why I love it. All right, so let's get into it. So I addressed this earlier really briefly, but yeah, the source material that Hitchcock and Hooper are both drawing on, and I'm sure many of you know this as horror fans, is Ed Gein, specifically the novel Psycho by Robert Bloch, which is based loosely off the Ed Gein murders. And if you don't know Ed Gein, if you're a horror fan but not a true crime fan, those are different things. Yeah. Yep. Ed Gein was a murderer from Wisconsin, not a serial killer, a murderer.
That's right. He only killed 2 people?
Yes.
Only.
Yeah, right.
Two
well,
more
yeah.
than most of us.
Right, yeah. Exactly. He killed 2 people, and he also exhumed bodies and made arts and crafts with the skin and bones.
Sound familiar?
Right. So those crimes are basically a before and after for American culture, because I think that was in the 50s, and social psychologists don't know what to do with it. And there's just an abundance of studies that pop up at this time because researchers are scrambling to understand how this could have happened. And so we get all these studies about repression in middle America there's some attempt to explain how this could have happened. And people are struggling to reconcile with the idea of this crime and the idea that this deviance could have occurred in our America, especially the wholesome,
like Midwest,
serene countryside. Right. And so he prompts further research into small town life and crime, and we all are kind of culturally reconciling with the fact that he's possibly a symptom of a bigger disease in America, right? So he even, and I'm going to talk about this on our next episode, he even affects the way our culture depicts transgender and non-conforming people, which I didn't know. But when you think about it, it makes perfect sense because there's so many takes on that crime too, which we'll get more into next week. He's also a kind of a before and after for the depiction of transgender people in pop culture. Another influence on Texas Chainsaw Massacre is Dean Corll and his associate Elmer Wayne Henley. These two are some of the scariest serial killers that I'd never heard of before I got into true crime, but they are like, it's truly a nightmare. They kidnapped and murdered, I think, like almost 30 teenage boys in the early 70s. And these two, especially Dean Corll, have lives that are completely at odds with their true selves. Like Dean Corll and his family owned and operated a candy factory. They gave away candy to the local kids. And by the way, these murders happened in Texas.
Oh.
And I guess in interviews, Tobe Hooper has said that they were also inspired by these crimes because it's the idea of this disparity in American values and our public America versus our private America. And they, Hooper and Henkel, describe it as kind of a quote unquote moral schizophrenia, which they see as this wave or maybe even a disease that's sweeping the country and even affecting people like up to President Nixon. Everyone, it's just this crazy, overwhelming thing that's affecting all of us culturally.
In what way? Like, especially when you say affecting President Nixon, do you mean like outwardly he's moral majority, real like law and order, and then privately it's exposed that, oh, he's actually a crook?
That, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And specifically, I have this a bit later because I want to talk about him and Drayton Sawyer, which I think is kind of fun theories.
Nixon and Drayton Sawyer?
Uh-huh.
All right.
But the idea of Nixon saying, peace is at hand, and then he bombs northern Vietnam on Christmas.
Okay.
Right.
Is that Drayton telling Sally that everything's okay, and then
kind of
goes and gets the broomstick?
A little bit. Yeah.
So Sally's Cambodia?
I don't know if the metaphor goes that far.
Okay.
But it's that idea of outer projection versus what's going on inside, right? Because outwardly, Nixon wants to be this great peacekeeper and be seen by the history books as someone who ends the war and is keeping peace. But then internally, he knows that this war is going to make it easier for him to deal with China and Russia, right? It's going to make it easier for him to negotiate. So he's got these two opposing forces going on. So it is a moral schizophrenia is how they phrase it.
Got it.
Yeah. So you want to read this quote from Tobe Hooper?
Sure. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a play about morality, in a strange way, and family values. It was all bubbling up at once out of the Times and out of Watergate. Once again, I underline that we found out as naive students that they don't always tell you the truth, so it's a film about a bad day for everyone. Leatherface, everyone.
Yeah, Leatherface has a bad day in this movie.
Yeah, he does. Leatherface's awful, no good, very bad day.
There's a really lengthy writing process for this film. I don't know if you talk about the writing process at all in the Kill Count. All right. So I guess the first approach they come up with together is this idea of a modern day fairy tale. It's weird that this keeps coming up in our film analyses.
Yeah, check out our Us review.
Yeah. And Kim Henkel says, do you want to read wanted to read all the quotes.
I do want to read all the
job.
quotes. Only instead of being lured to a gingerbread cottage with gumdrops, it was a little more sinister.
Right. So this is something that it's this simple plot, this simple fairy tale type plot, something that Christopher Sharrett, who he's a professor of film studies, and he wrote a key essay about Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I have listed in the description. It's the idea of apocalypse in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He refers to it as a Hansel and Gretel type story, and he also kind of compares the dinner scene to the Mad Tea Party, right? And these are story elements that we're familiar with, and because they're so familiar and we associate them with childhood and even innocence, they're really evocative. And that's why this movie doesn't need to lean so hard on dialogue, because the plot is so simple. The second half of the movie especially, there's not a ton of dialogue.
It's mostly screaming.
Right, yeah. And this movie on its surface is not a cerebral, heady movie that's difficult to understand, and that's by design. Yeah. So it is worth noting, too, that Hansel and Gretel does feature kidnapping, imprisonment, and attempted cannibalism. So beyond our association with folk tales and fairy tales with childhood, what are those stories meant to do if not kind of expose or discuss the dark underbelly of human nature? They're cautionary tales for kids, and they emphasize social codes and the proper order of civilization, right? They're life lessons. And so this leads nicely into talking about this concept of repression, and we're going to go like full academia here, but I'm going to make it fun. Which draws from Freudian theory. Yeah, he came up, we're talking about Freud. So it's going to start, you might think it's sounding a little out there, and I'm going to be throwing around patriarchy and capitalism and oppression. You might check out and think I'm just making word salad, right? Like it's just academia word salad. But Robin Woods, and he also is a film scholar and professor, and his writing on repression and horror films specifically is so crucial to horror study. If you take a class on horror films at all in college, you will talk about Robin Wood, and he lays such a groundwork for why Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just a genius movie. He thinks it's an artistic accomplishment and he thinks it's so much deeper than what people think it is, and I think he's a figure responsible for horror being taken a little more seriously in academia, so he's cool. So, okay, here we go. So basic repression.
Okay.
This is unavoidable, and that's what separates us from animals, right? Like we can delay gratification. We can consider other people's feelings. It's the stuff that makes us
It's like, I want to punch you in the face, but I won't.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, because you can consider my feelings.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that was a informal you.
Yeah,
I never want to punch you in the face.
No, we're doing a hypothetical role play scenario.
Yeah.
Then we have surplus repression.
Ooh.
And this is what's culturally created. So we're kind of raised, so we're talking Western culture here. Mm-hmm. We're raised from birth to fall into predetermined roles. And in our Western culture, we're pressured to be monogamous. We're pressured to be heterosexual. We're pressured to aspire to a higher social class. And we're pressured to buy into patriarchy and capitalism. Like that's a fact. That's how our society is organized. And by the way, keep in mind too, this essay is from the 80s. So if any of this sounds a little dated, it's from the 80s.
Sure. Because I do think some of that's changed.
Exactly.
There's definitely not as much pressure to be heterosexual now. There's more accepting of deviations from that.
Right. But I would still say overall, yeah, I think this still holds true. So whatever isn't repressed then has to be dealt with by oppression.
Okay.
An ideal member of our society is someone who's sexually monogamous under the construct of a heterosexual union meant for procreation.
Sounds Christian.
Very Christian. And so we tamp down those feelings, and we can turn those feelings into productive, non-fulfilling work in an office or a factory. I promise this is still an episode about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's important to kind of discuss those things, which sound unrelated but aren't, I promise.
Okay.
Because it brings us to the idea of the other, which is so, again, crucial to horror theory. And I think once I start talking about the other, you'll see, okay, I get where we're going now. And the other represents what our dominant ideology that we live in can't deal with. And so it either has to reject it, destroy it, or assimilate it. So this isn't something that's necessarily foreign or external either. It's something that we all consistently repressed, which we project outwards as something that's hated or forbidden. And so I think the example he gave was when the Puritans came to America, because they so repressed sexuality and sex was just evil, they project that outwards and they see the Native Americans as like sexual demons, right?
Okay.
It's projection, like classic projection.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So woman is an other. We fear femininity in our culture. And again, that's why calling a man unmanly is the ultimate insult, right?
Yeah, like throw like a girl.
Exactly. The proletariat or working class. And we have a myth in our culture of kind of a dirty, stupid, disease-ridden working class. And so that's where we get to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because that family is a monstrous embodiment of the working class, and they're the nightmare version of the working class.
It's really weird too. American culture kind of has this like two-sided treatment of the working class, because in one instance, like the public facing instance, it holds them up as the shrine of like, this is what embodies America and you know, the American dream, and like we love the working class and the middle class, and then yet so many policies and actual things that go on don't help those people.
Right.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I guess that's probably something that's occurred all throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
That
is, again, this is not, I'm using it in relationship to American culture because it still holds true, and because that's kind of what Texas Chainsaw Massacre is working off of. But yeah, that's just kind of our culture in general.
Just people.
Yeah, class hierarchy and stuff. Quick run through of some other examples of the other, which you can think of probably a bunch of horror movies that maybe embody these. We have other cultures, ethnic groups within a culture, alternative ideologies. 1950s sci-fi is the fear of communism, so that's kind of how the other manifests in those movies. Sexual deviations and children. It's why the creepy kid, the idea of the creepy child, is so prominent in horror, because they're a blank slate, right?
Yeah.
It's this fear of not being able to control or mold this blank slate that we bring into the world, and what happens if they just decide to rebel or not fit in or assimilate. That's why they're scary. So Robin Wood claims that this is his foundation for the theory of the American horror film. Do you want to read his quote?
Sure. Central to it is the dual concept of the repressed/the other in the figure of the monster. One might say that the true subject of the horror genre is the struggle for recognition of all that our civilization represses or oppresses, its reemergence dramatized, as in our nightmares, as an object of horror, a matter for terror, and the happy ending, when it exists, typically signifying the restoration of repression.
Right, so Robin Wood, again, we owe so much to him for legitimizing horror in academia. His work is so important, even though when you start getting into it, it seems a little inaccessible. But once it finally clicks and once you kind of get what he's going for, it's really, really interesting. He thinks that horror films they're experiencing waking dreams, or in horror's case, nightmares. And so beyond our awareness of basic plot, character, action, which is why I say Texas Chainsaw seems very simple on the surface, we get subversive messaging that can kind of slip through unnoticed. It's amazing how much you can pack into a horror film when it seems very simple on the surface. And because we are kind of familiar even subconsciously with the rules of our culture, like the ideas of the other and things that we repress, those all ring true, and they seem familiar because those are rules we're all raised with, right? And because of that shared set of rules, when we go see a horror movie, we're all having a collective nightmare together. And I think that that's such a cool way to think about horror.
Because we've all been kind of raised with the same values, and this is us experiencing a affront to those.
Right,
altogether.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing because people can be watching the movie together, and when they're confronted with this breaking of the norms that they've all been raised with, they could have different reactions of like celebrating that or being like legit uncomfortable and scared of it.
Yeah, he talks a lot about that, right? The idea of watching a horror film and you root for the monster.
Yeah.
And that's why it feels good to root for the monster, because he thinks, and I kind of agree, that the monster is so symbolic of what we repress that it feels good to watch it be unleashed.
Just
and
let it all out.
Yeah, it's a catharsis in a way. And that's why few horror monsters are unsympathetic. Like Leatherface is sympathetic. He's a bad guy. He's a murderer.
He is a murderer.
But there's something about him that is very, I find him sympathetic.
I mean, when he sits down on that chair after having to kill the third teen who's barged into his house, and it's just like, oh, come on.
Is that when we get that really nice shot of his teeth?
Yeah, that's when it's the slow zoom in on him just licking his teeth.
Were Gunnar Hansen's teeth like that?
No.
Okay.
They were all fake teeth.
They look real.
I know, same thing with Bill Moseley and Chop Top.
Especially watching like a Blu-ray transfer of this, sometimes you see, those Blu-ray transfers and it's like, oh no, that we're not supposed to see it like this.
No, they're good fake teeth.
Yeah. But, and even despite how evil the family is, they still evoke really complicated feelings because their dynamic it's something that's familiar to us. They're a caricature, but they still are this nuclear family that feels weirdly familiar. And we're kind of forced to relate to them and even get the sense that they're victims too, and they're victims of this idea of capitalism that's kind of chewed them up and spit them out. They're victims of a workforce that doesn't need them anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's best exemplified very early on by the hitchhiker, aka Nubbins, when they're in the van and Franklin's talking about the air gun that has been developed and is now used to kill cattle.
That's no good. That's no good.
Hitchhiker's that's good. You got to do it yourself. Hit him with the hammer.
Exactly. And I think a thing that's so interestingly, I didn't pick up on this, but something that's really distinctly human about them is that they don't waste anything, right? They repurpose everything they eat as furniture or decorations, and that's something we're taught as kids, right? It's like, don't waste stuff. 1970s horror too, something that's really special and unique about it is that when we start getting horror framed as purely American, and that's a big part of Texas Chainsaw Massacre too. It's why it's set in Texas. Texas is like such an Americana state, right? Yeah. And the family, which is always kind of a normality in the monster/normality dynamic, is now capable of also being the monster in these newer horror films.
It's not a monster tormenting a family. Right. It's a monstrous family.
Right, exactly. and that's why Psycho's so important, man. Psycho is such a milestone for that because the family in that is the evil.
Sure, yeah, Norman and Norma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 70s horror says, fuck old-fashioned family values. The family is just as fucked up as everything else. Yeah.
Just because you have a family doesn't mean you're good.
Right, exactly. So before the 70s, evil's just always foreign. Whether it's ethnically foreign, so think of really the purposeful setting and casting and everything of movies like Frankenstein and Dracula, the two Eastern European actors like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. It's like they're foreign men. They're set in Germany and then Transylvania. It's this very like that doesn't happen here. That happens over in Europe or somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. Then even we move through the 50s. Okay, we got movies that are taking place in America, but the evil is still foreign. It's invasion. Aliens or insect species,
Or
something
science
that's
gone wrong.
Yeah, it's not us though.
The Americans are the victims.
Right, exactly. But now in the 70s, it's the monster is finally us. So beyond the that kind of monster fairy tale, folktale allegory, Hooper, I guess, suggests adding apocalyptic elements. And so we have motifs like the old abandoned house, which we also see around this time used to great effect in Night of the Living Dead, like a house to demonstrate apocalypse, especially in America, where that's the ultimate dream, right? Is to own a home.
Exactly.
That's what we all are told to aspire to.
Because the house is a status of success and making it, and to see one abandoned is to suggest that something went wrong here.
Right. And Hooper also, while he's writing this, gets very fascinated by sunspots and solar flares.
That explains the opening credits.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we're gonna talk. Yes, I'm gonna talk so much about the solar flares and all the crazy like astrological shit, which I always like noticed but never factored them into my interpretation.
Oh yeah,
of the
because
movie.
Pam is all about astrology.
Yes. Okay. So I guess at this time, so August 1972, U.S. cable lines are disrupted by a gigantic solar flare, and there's 6 days of record-breaking levels of solar activity. This is like a big thing that happened, apparently. And then I was researching more of this and got so off topic. I would have talked so much more about solar flares if
Just a
this
Wikipedia
wasn't
hole?
so long. Yeah, I went down a legit Wikipedia hole. And this is Hooper's quote about that element of the script. He describes it as the
structural puzzle pieces, the way it folds continuously back in on itself, and no matter where you're going, it's the wrong place.
yeah. So he's got this apocalyptic cosmic mindset while he's writing, and so another moment in the 70s we should kind of elaborate on, because I think it goes nicely with the idea of apocalypse in this movie, is the oil crisis in 1973. And in an interview, Hooper describes that moment in history as it seeming like the Western world was going to fall apart.
Yeah, that's a big moment.
Right. And so what happened was Middle Eastern nations stopped exporting oil to certain countries, including the United States, as punishment for our involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this caused huge surges in oil prices and gas shortages.
Would you fill her up, please?
I got no gas.
You're out of gas?
My tank's empty.
There were gas stations in real life with signs that would say no gasoline, right? That's not just a convenient plot thing. That's just how it was for a little bit in the 70s.
And it's interesting because it is like an important plot element here. They run out of gas and that screws them over.
Yeah.
But like, it's based in truth.
That wasn't just for fun. That's not just a joke or written in there for fun. That's just what was going on at the time. That wouldn't have been a surprise to them. You know, they should have planned it. And we also have the end of the peace love movement of the late 60s. We've got the Manson family, I feel like, is cited as a big, like, that's a marker for the end of the 60s. They're the evil underbelly of peaceful communal hippie culture. And the deaths at Altamont too. And Altamont it was the same year. I think it was both 69, Altamont and Woodstock. And Woodstock is obviously we all know Woodstock. It's the famous music festival. It all went great. Yeah. And then we have Altamont, which is another music festival where the Hells Angels are hired to be security, and a bunch of people died. Someone got stabbed during a Rolling Stones set. You can watch a documentary about it called Gimme Shelter. It's very good. But yep, Altamont is another, people consider that as another moment where the 60s ended. The late 60s leading into the 70s is one of America's most chaotic times, and it's understandable that this would have been overwhelming, and it could have maybe felt like there was something bigger going on or something cosmic because it was just so crazy, right?
Yeah, so constant.
Yeah.
And I love that, like, you know, the final couple seasons of Mad Men, you see this reflected in just like the
Mad Men
chaos.
does a good job at showing that.
Yeah, just showing how the characters are reacting to it. Even people who are kind of isolated from it.
Yeah, like
them.
Betty.
Yeah.
Betty Draper.
And even Don, like, you know, he's an upper class, like, rich man, but he still is affected by it.
I mean, that's why the opening credits are the man falling from the skyscraper. It's, yeah. we get that sense in this movie too. The opening with the radio announcer, he's talking about corpses dug up in the cemetery and news of other disasters like a discovery of a body with genitals missing, terrorism, oil spills, arson. And so it's this bigger picture of like this evil time.
Yeah, the world falling apart.
Yeah. And then we get the images of the sun in the beginning and the astrology book.
The condition of retrogradation is contrary or inharmonious to the regular direction of actual movement in the zodiac, and is in that respect evil.
You have these visual parallels between the sun and the moon and these macro zoom images of Sally's eyes, which when we watched it with our friends, that was imagery that really stuck out because
insane.
it's so... that cinematography is nuts.
It's so close.
It's so close.
It's incredible.
Right. But so when you think about it, it's like the sun and someone's eyeball are these two structures that from far away aren't, the sun looks pretty chill from far away and someone's eyeball's an eyeball, but then you get up close and it's just chaos and gross and you see all of her veins.
Yeah.
It's so
It's
nasty.
intense.
Yeah. So it's the age of Aquarius is kind of ending, in hair. He's saying about the age of Aquarius. I love hair. But then it's the age of Saturn is here. That's what Pam was talking about in the van.
Retrograde.
Yeah, so that's bringing a loss of control and evil. And so it's our victims in this movie are losing control of their fates, and so are the monsters too. They seem to completely lack control mentally and physically. I mean, Leatherface even is running around, he's skidding all over the place with his chainsaw. He's so big and he's like a little cartoon character, but there's just total lack of control. And I think the astrology and the sun imagery in the beginning really set that up as some kind of bigger thing, making everything just fall apart. Right. We witness the downward spiral of everyone in this film towards barbarism, even unknowingly. Like at the very beginning, almost, our protagonists are buying and eating meat that they get at the gas station, and so unknowingly they've become cannibals. And
yeah, Franklin has it in his mouth for a very long time.
It
Just
looks nasty.
Sucking on that.
He's chomping on it, yeah. And the ease during the rest of this film, which everyone interacts with this world, also kind of, there's something so off-putting about it, and it kind of signals this weird acceptance of this apocalypse. Because think about when they go visit the old homestead, the Hardesty home where their grandpa lived. That house is so fucking creepy, and and they're just, no one reacts to it. They're just like, it's grandpa's old house,
Yeah,
and
this is my old room.
Yeah, and it's disgusting. The only time anyone notices anything weird is when I think it's I forget all their names.
Kirk sees some spiders.
That's it. Yeah, the nest of spiders.
Which is weird.
I hate that
gross
part.
shot.
It's so gross.
Franklin also notices the bones on the porch.
He
and he's a
does.
little unnerved by that.
Yes, but the willingness to which they just run in there.
Mm-hmm. And same thing when Kirk and Pam just hear the engine running and are like, let's just go to this farmhouse and check it out.
They all are just willing to go along with whatever, and it's so weird. The world of this movie doesn't allow for change or control when you think about it, and that's why the ending itself is kind of abrupt, and I think to a lot of people even feels anticlimactic, right? 'Cause
it is very abrupt.
It just kind of happens,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not a sense of closure to this movie, and we're denied a feeling of a proper ending, and we get the idea that the world of this movie is just going to return back to this crisis. And again, it's this idea of an evil age. Like, just because our one character gets away, that doesn't mean the evil of this time is over, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's bigger than the characters of this movie. The idea of evil in this movie, too, depends crucially on cannibalism. That's what the whole movie's about. That's what they're all about. And that's something we've always seen as evil. It's
Cannibalism is like one of the biggest no-nos.
Yes. It's so interesting how, like, worldwide too, like, just like all world cultures, I think that is the most accepted taboo.
Which is interesting because we eat meat.
Right.
We eat every other animal, and yet, and I'm not saying that this is wrong, but when it comes to eating one of our own, that is the ultimate wrong.
And it's so fascinating that's like all humans have felt that way.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Right. So we kind of, just as people, it's like our weird monkey brains, we understand that society's not going to resort to cannibalism unless it's the end time, or like it's a last resort to do that.
Yeah.
And so Sally's torture in this movie is almost ritualistic, and it kind of, you get the idea of the cannibalism in this movie being some kind of apocalyptic ritual. It's so staged. She's sitting there for dinner, almost on a throne, right? with all the bones on it and stuff. And she's kind of a scapegoat too. She's like an outlet for their shared aggression, and it made me think of that short story, The Lottery.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Where a town draws numbers, and the person who draws the wrong number gets stoned to death.
Yeah.
It's just like an outlet. It's
an
kind of like The
outlet.
Purge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's an outlet. And so in that way, Hooper doesn't really focus on what's done to Sally, which ends up not being a ton anyway.
She
but
gets her finger cut open and a couple of hits to the back of the head.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
But he focuses on her terror and the emotional projection that the cannibals are putting onto her. And that's what's so disturbing.
Yeah. A hitchhiker just mocking her so much.
Yeah. So the author of this piece about Apocalypse and Texas Chainsaw, Christopher Sharrett, he kind of says it's extreme to argue that Hooper's doing this all consciously, kind of reworking this idea of cannibalistic ritual, because it's getting into some super academic shit. Like his essay is very academic, but it's the idea of subconscious cultural ideas that make make their way into things that we create, right? Not even intentionally, but he thinks it's interesting to note and important to note because also the 70s we get kind of this increased occurrence of cannibalism movies too. If you look at what movies came out during that decade, because it's Hills Have Eyes, Night of the Living Dead, Cannibal Holocaust is at the end of the 70s. That's like 1980, but
yeah,
it's just interesting to kind of note.
And yeah, I think it's also important to note, maybe it's important, but it's interesting at least to know that Tobe Hooper was around 30 when he made this movie, and he is coming from the University of Austin, Texas, or the University of Texas, Austin. He might have dropped out of college, but he did have some college education in some film studies. So it's definitely fair to say that all this was, or at least some of it was intentional, because he's not like some 22-year-old dude who's like
goofing around with his friends.
Yeah, just making like, this is a 30-year-old man making this movie.
Yeah.
And yeah, like he'll have been old enough to, form opinions and kind of matured a bit. Mm-hmm. It's not just, it'd be really cool if like we had these cannibals eat this woman.
Yeah, exactly. This lack of catharsis too at the end, and why this movie I think so disturbs people when they watch it, is there's so much circularity in this movie and this feeling of things not ending or things being resolved. Sally goes from the gas station to the house, to the gas station to the house, and there's all these shots of windmills, and someone goes missing, and okay, we'll go look for him, and then someone else goes missing, and we'll go look for him. And there's this implication that the cannibals too have done this over and over and over again. The house is already covered in bones.
All the cars that they have out front.
Yeah.
Where did those come from?
It is like this endless nightmare cycle, right?
I think that the biggest indication of a lack of closure here for me is that fucking semi-truck driver. Where did he go?
It was amazing doing this research. No one talks about that
No
guy.
one ever brings it up.
Yeah.
What the fuck happened to that guy?
I know. I want to know what happened to him. But like we've already mentioned it, but that last shot, Sally escapes, but it doesn't feel good. She's laughing crazily, and we kind of get the sense that this drama is not going to resolve so easily.
Fun little real life imitating art there is actually they shot that scene and they shot it at the end and filming this movie was hell.
A nightmare.
It was
sounds
hell.
Terrible.
Especially that dinner scene was like a 26-hour shoot straight. So they filmed that last scene, and then
Marilyn Burns.
Then Marilyn Burns goes home and she like cleans herself and she's done, and they call her and they're like, we didn't get it. That last shot. They had to come back. She had to come back and refilm that final escape scene in the back of the truck. So when she's laughing, she was like, that was real. That was me being like, I'm done.
God.
I'm done.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh no, I
Yep.
know that feeling.
Yeah, we didn't get it.
Oh my God. Oh boy. Even the mask is kind of a symbol of this social breakdown. It's this barrier between open human interactions and the fact that it's human skin reminds us constantly of death and decay
It's like
and
this facade of human.
Yeah.
Like it's a human face, but it's not his human face. It's it ties back into that duality we talked about.
yeah, and keeping Grandpa around. Like, he's still alive, but he's essentially a corpse. And he's kind of this callback to the good old days, right? And we don't learn. We still give him the sledge, even though he can't fucking do it.
Yeah,
he's impotent. Yeah.
But he was so good. He was the best at killing.
Yeah, maybe 50 years ago, sure.
He's apparently supposed to be 124.
Wow. What's his secret?
His all liquid diet,
Oh.
as they say in the second movie.
Yeah, family of Draculas. That's what Franklin says, right?
Oh, does he?
Mm-hmm.
I think we just picked up Dracula.
My family's always been in me.
A whole family of Draculas.
The cannibalism too, and this repetition, this pattern of circles and repetition, starting to sound like Rust Cole. Like
Time is a
real
flat
true
circle.
detective here. It kind of reminds us of what the family's built on, and at the same time what America's built on too, right? Our country, our civilizing process was built on the blood, bone, and skin of other people. And that's recent history too. That's ingrained in our country's DNA. As we were built on violence, and we can't build a foundation of a civilization with murder and just expect that to fade away, right? Like, we're always going to keep coming back to that. That's always going to surface.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seems like there's almost this impending doom in America in the 70s. It feels like everything is about to collapse, and this feeling of annihilation being an inevitability because I think we become a bit more aware. We've been talking our Indian Burial Grounds episode about how in the 70s there's more Native American like civil rights movements going on. And so I think we're a bit more aware culturally and publicly about our very bloody past.
Okay, yeah. And I think coupled with the civil rights movement that preceded that, which would have been like a reminder of slavery and that like blood labor that the country was built upon. Like, we wouldn't be a rich country if it hadn't been for slavery for so long.
Right. And so I think it maybe feels that this increase in violence in the 70s is almost it's that past coming back to haunt us,
It's
right?
like America's comeuppance.
Yeah, and it's us just going through these cycles of violence that seem inescapable, and there's almost a morbid desire to kind of watch the country eat itself in a weird way. It just doesn't feel like there's a way to fix it. Do you want to read this quote by Christopher Sharrett?
Sure. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre represents a crucial moment in the history of the horror genre, when the form develops a specific relationship to the historical and cultural trend discussed and to a distinct period of discontent in American society. Although Hooper's film has been analyzed incorrectly as being a forerunner of the slasher films of the 1970s, its scope is far broader and more significant.
So Henkel, I guess, Kim Henkel, wants to counterbalance this more supernatural idea that there's some bigger force, more ambiguous, mythical force that's responsible for the evilness of this time with more grounded social motivations for the film, maybe more like world specific to why, what turns someone into a killer and why would we have this family, like what happened to them, right?
Which is interesting because the answer he eventually comes to when he writes Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation is Illuminati.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what happened.
Oh my God, that's right, because he did write that.
He wrote
one.
and directed Next Generation.
Boy.
Yep.
Wow, it's weird that he apparently wanted to do less supernatural and weird for the first one, but then
I guess Illuminati isn't supernatural; it's just conspiratorial.
Sure.
So maybe I don't know.
Yeah. So Kim Henkel and Tobe Hooper come up with this family of rednecks whose way of life is threatened, and they're uneducated and they've been laid off because of this revolution in technology in their industry, and their town's falling apart, and they blame it on the modern world and then take this out on teenagers visiting their town.
what could be a better representation of the modern world than teenagers?
Yeah, we're obsessed with teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's like what post 1950s I think is when teenagers are a demographic.
They get their own culture and influence.
So there's some really interesting stuff going back to that like small town research that was going on around the time of Ed Gein. There's some really interesting stuff that comes out of that, particularly from this guy named Michael Lessie, who wrote a book. I think he was traveling through Wisconsin and like the general Midwest area. He finds that frustration and anxiety set in among this group of already exploited and disenfranchised people by the hands of entrepreneurial capitalism, right? It's working class. And on top of this exploitation of a rural working class, we have the development of East and West Coast cities. This is all starting to sound very familiar, I think. Mm-hmm. And this further alienates the middle of the country economically. And this gives us our silent majority, which was coined by Richard Nixon. And that's a group of people that we see as angry and vengeful.
And fearful, I think, of the changes around them. Because, Nixon said the silent majority would elect him in 68, and they did, even though it was like we said, civil rights, turbulent period. But Nixon, the more conservative candidate, won, banking on, this silent majority.
Mm-hmm. Was he Law and Order, too? Was that Reagan?
They both were. Yeah.
I don't know who used that as like a tagline. I guess they both
I think
would have.
Nixon, but I think they both would have.
Yeah. But this is when we get these these seemingly unfathomable and nonsensical crimes, as it's people acting out in the face of crisis and acting destructively when there doesn't really seem to be any chance for change or improvement, and everything is terrible. Why bother acting like it's not? And I'm not justifying that, but I'm saying these researchers found that that's what was going on when you get shit like Ed Gein or violence in rural communities, is when you take away that meaning to their lives, and they don't have there's nothing for them to productively contribute, so you get this kind of stuff happening.
Yeah. Oh, and I like this the demonstration of this idea is Franklin, after the hitchhiker cuts himself with his hand, which always stuck out to me.
Yes.
He also slashes Franklin's arm shortly after that. But for me, the thing that always stuck out,
him cutting himself
with that knife.
I loved this because I was reading about these studies, and I think that really resonated with me was oh my God, I think this film is kind of saying that, and I think that's why the hitchhiker, he cuts himself, and then we have Franklin very purposely wondering, that must really take something to do that.
And that guy cut the hell out of himself. You think you could do that to yourself?
Like crazy?
Yeah, but, it takes something, though. I mean, just to do that to yourself like he did, God.
And so if you kind of look at that research, it's because this hitchhiker and his family are part of this group of people who their outlet's been taken away, right? And so that it really has taken something for him to be able to do that to himself. It's self-destruction.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Right. Yeah.
How come? I thought the gun was better.
Oh, no. With the new way people put out of jobs.
The horror in this movie is really derived from American ideology, taboos, our institutions of family, working class, capitalism. But we've got all these, in this movie, perverted versions of those things, like really weird upside down versions of those things. And so our social mores are so ingrained that even when our day-to-day routine is gutted, or in this movie, our livelihoods made redundant, we still kind of cling to that structure. And I think that's why this movie's so creepy, is because it so recognizes these structures that are very American and then gives us these weird monster versions of them. It's going back to the monster family, right?
Yeah.
And when the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family, the Sawyer family, they're not called that in this, though,
they're
right?
Not.
That's just the sequel.
I think that's when they say Drayton Sawyer. In the sequel,
he wins his that chili contest.
Yeah. And also, I love about the sequel is that he's up and down that movie is complaining about the plight of small business owners.
Yes.
He's always saying
it's
the
so
small
funny.
business owner, they get fucked in the ass.
So yeah, when they're kind of all made redundant, they don't have a purpose anymore in the social order. Even the family unit is kind of pointless too, because there's no women in their family.
Yeah.
So in the eyes of our culture, like we've talked about with the idea of repression, it's like our ideal family is one that procreates. It's man, woman, they have kids, but this family doesn't have that. And so their family unit, it gets all weird too.
Yeah.
And so they cling to these established social norms anyway, and so they still work, quote unquote, and they're still a family, but they're just weird deviant versions of these things. So we've got Sally at dinner. She's both guest and the meal, and it looks like a parody of a Norman Rockwell painting, like the famous Thanksgiving dinner painting. That's what I'm sure that a Texas Chainsaw version of that exists. I'm sure you can buy prints of it online.
For sure.
But it's perverting small town hospitality and traditional family values. And even think about Drayton, who's not named that in this, but I'm just going to call him that, the older brother, not the dad.
Yeah.
He's getting angry at Leatherface destroying the door. He's like, look what your brother did to that door. Yeah, and in moments like where he gets back out of the truck to turn the light off at the gas station, it's like this emphasis on home and electric bills and just such
that.
American little things. I mean, not to say that that's not a thing in other countries, but it's.
But yeah, he puts Sally in a bag in his truck and goes to leave, and then sees that the light is on.
And turn the lights off.
And gets back in the truck, is like, they'll kill you with the electric bill.
Yeah, exactly. That's all these little markers of things that we're familiar with, you know? And there's even some attempt to fulfill that ideal family structure, right? Like I said, it's a family of all men who can't procreate, but Leatherface is he's the weakest male. Like they all gang up on him and they're so mean.
Yeah.
And he, I think, is almost forced into playing the female role. I think that's why we see him with makeup on and he's cross-dressing at certain parts. And Drayton tells him to get back into the kitchen where he belongs. And we're also probably going to talk about Leatherface, too, on our trans representation episode and those myths about Ed Gein. But I totally buy the analysis that he's forced into this kind of role because so much else about the cannibal family is a mockery of traditional American families. Like they work and they have a white house with a fence, and so they kind of need like a female role. But I also do I agree with the criticism that trend of cross-dressing horror villains is a bummer, and
yeah,
I think they're both true, right? So, but the absence of a woman, it leaves this family of men to go animalistic and primal. That's a trope in films.
Testosterone.
I think in Westerns, that's a big trope too, is the woman is always, they have one woman and she's always the beacon of civility. And so they don't have woman. Leatherface isn't quite up to par, I don't think. And so the woman, Sally, is a target of their anger. But interestingly, there's no sexual threat to Sally. I think that's that's something that stands out to me about this movie. Horror films in the 70s, and this is something I don't like about them, is they're very sexually violent.
One of the few horror films that does come before this one is Last House on the Left.
Yes.
And that is a rape revenge story.
It is
with a graphic.
I have seen it once. I don't know that I ever need to see it again. It's it's terrifying. I found it so genuinely disturbing, but this movie, you get that same gross 70s feeling, but there's no sexual violence in this, and I think it's just sexuality in this world has been so distorted and repressed that I think it is manifested in this movie as this phallic chainsaw, right? I don't think the chainsaw is an accident. It just looks like a giant dick. It is a dick in the second movie.
Yeah, the second one gets way more into that because Drayton even says explicitly, It's either the chainsaw or sex, and sex, well, no one really knows what that is. Like, they don't know what sex
Exactly,
is.
exactly, yeah. And there's also that desire to literally consume a woman, right? It's the ultimate act of possession, and it can also be seen as a demonstration of the end of capitalism, right? This system where we're okay feeding off of other people to survive, metaphorically and literally, you know. But again, in the weird, like, adherence to family structure, Drayton is the father figure who's, like, still trying to comfort her as they're getting ready for...
Like, don't worry, Grandpa's the best at killing.
He's the best at
He'll
killing.
be okay.
Right. Yeah, those blurred lines between, like, animal and man and violence and all of that feeling so weird. I think you really get that right off the bat with the radio report. And I talked about that a little bit, but it's the brutality of the world and violence of mankind. And the first, you said that image of the corpses in the graveyard. These two corpses in an explicit position on top of a tombstone. And it evokes right off the bat, we have sex and death.
Yeah.
Which are the two most powerful repressed urges and, like, taboos, right?
Yeah, and motivators.
Yeah, exactly. And so those forces are so powerful, violence and sex, that they threaten productive work and they threaten rationality. And so it's like these super animalistic things we have to tamp down in order to have a society. Yeah. And so, but in the world of Texas Chainsaw, the Sawyer family, up until now, they've been having their cake and eating it too, because their work has been so violent up to this point. They've been able to, in their jobs at the slaughterhouse, satisfy those primal violent urges through their work. And so within our system, that's all cool because that's their labor. They're producing wealth and they are being productive. And if they're getting sick pleasure out of it, it doesn't matter because it's still benefiting, like, whoever owns the slaughter, whoever's, like, making the money off of that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the hitchhiker shares his experiences working in the slaughterhouse, which disgust everyone. And
He even has pictures of him.
Yeah.
Like, he's proud of his work.
Their work has served two purposes up till now. They're creating products, but they're also directing these violent impulses towards productive labor, in which we understand when he just lights up when he's talking about his old work at the slaughterhouse and how was it the canister, the
air gun?
The air gun is no good.
Yeah, find you a person who talks about you the way the hitchhiker talks about killing animals with a hammer.
Oh yeah. But yeah, it's the idea of once you give someone a little bit of license to be violent, like we give these slaughterhouse workers, they take out their violent urges on these animals, other urges towards violence can start coming up. So it's like in war, the taboo of killing is pardoned because we rationalize it as necessary, kind of like this torture essentially of animals. We rationalize it as necessary because it's productive, it's for an end purpose. And think of war, you hear wartime atrocities like torture and
like civilian
murder,
yeah,
exactly, where it's like you give someone a little bit of license and then those urges come out.
Yeah, and that's why like hitting things and as an expression of anger is not a healthy outlet.
Right, exactly, because it's this exact same idea. It's literally like, yeah, the slaughterhouse workers are hitting these animals and giving them these prolonged deaths. That's not tamping down these urges. It's giving them license to do it, and they're just going to want to keep doing it.
The opposite of the purge.
Yes. So being unemployed takes away that outlet, so they then direct that at humans. So that's where you get the humans as animals reading of this, which I think is I totally buy that reading. Toby Hooper said it's a film about meat.
Yeah.
Like, that's a quote of his.
And I guess he became a vegetarian for a short while.
Yes.
After making this movie.
Yeah. Pam being captured and put on the meat hook, and she has to watch Leatherface mutilate her boyfriend with a chainsaw. And it's like, that's not unlike a slaughterhouse.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we do that to animals. And, animals are smart. Lastly, they decide on Texas as their setting, which we talked a little bit about before, but it so clearly evokes our past, the Wild West and our pioneer origins. And even, we think of pioneers wearing buckskin and Leatherface just wearing human skin. And yeah, like we mentioned before, the film kind of implies that the seeming increase in violence of the 1970s and seeming collapse of society, that it's inevitable because it's so ingrained in our DNA. Like, America is violent. It's always been violent. That's just part of our heritage, unfortunately. And this is when we get the importance of Franklin, because he, I think, is the character who most understands right away that there's something very wrong here. He's the most afraid during the movie too. He recognizes himself in the hitchhiker, like when he talks about the knife and realizing could he make himself do that? I think he gets that there's such a fine line between him and the hitchhiker mentally, or he could do that, and he sees his own repressed kind of barbaric drive mirrored.
I've in support of that, they both do the same thing when they're frustrated, blowing raspberries.
Yeah.
Because when they drive away from the hitchhiker, he spends a long time just... And then later on in their family home, when Franklin is isolated from everyone else because of his physical disability.
He's in a wheelchair, so he can't... Limited accessibility in the hardesty manner.
And he just sits there blowing raspberries up at the ceiling.
Right. So, and that, I think that really emphasizes that these two worlds are very close. Even the houses are close to each other. Did Franklin and Sally, have they met this family before?
Right, yeah,
Who
that's
knows?
weird, because they used to live in that house.
Right, yeah, and their worlds are very close. They're parallel, but they do overlap, and so it's these lines between normal family and degenerate family, and it's the lines between our outwardly facing America, like what we present, and what's underneath, right? Our traditional family values and our structures and rules and our civilization versus this other version of America where it's brutal and violent and very cruel. And I think Franklin and Leatherface are so key to kind of understanding that mirrored relationship in this movie. And they're both the odd one out of their respective groups, and they're both belittled by the other people. Franklin also is the only one who's murdered with the chainsaw.
It's the one murder Leatherface does that's not a result of someone walking into his house.
That's right.
The other kids he kills, sure, they're invading his home.
It's a home invasion movie.
Franklin's just going around in the woods.
And yeah, we have Drayton Sawyer too, talking again about that kind of like moral schizophrenia. By the way, that's the academic term I'm using. I realize it's probably not a great term, but it's from I think Toby Hooper used it to describe. Yeah. So that's like how they've described their thesis of this movie. Drayton's got this clearly barbaric side, and he enjoys torturing Sally, but
because he sits there poking her with a broomstick that whole drive, and then later on when Hitchhiker's saying he's just the cook, Drayton's like, I just can't abide by killing.
I don't enjoy killing, but you gotta do it. And there's even, this is from the script apparently. Do you want to read this quote from the script?
Yeah, sure. Drayton seems to enjoy torturing Sally, but at the same time to be afraid that the torture will produce some terrible reaction with which he will be unable to cope.
Then we have Grandpa, who's the best at killing. And he brings to mind, he's the good old days of slaughter and bloodshed, right? He's pretty much dead now, but we keep him around in reverence. It's this really creepy respect for Grandpa, and they play it up to Sally like it's an honor to be murdered by Grandpa. They're like, oh, it's gonna be awesome. Like, this is, and he's so good at killing that it's worthwhile to get murdered by him, even when we see he's clearly impotent, right?
Yeah.
We cling so hard to this glorified past. Then at the end we have Sally escaping, and at this point in this episode and in the conversation about this movie, Sally represents so much, right? Like, depending on what angle you're looking at this movie at, she could represent the youth of America versus like the older generation, like the traditional like grandpa zombie generation, or a civility as opposed to barbarism, or even just woman as opposed to man. But whatever reading that you look at her through, the ending of this is so bleak. She's seemingly regressed into savagery, and I guess in the original script she's written as crying instead of laughing, but I think crying implies that there's some sense of closure or catharsis or ending, and that there's maybe room for her to put this behind her and move on.
Because that would kind of be like the normal reaction. Like the healthy kind of reaction.
Sure.
As opposed to laughing.
Yeah, and laughter, I think, it just implies that something's broken or something has just been irreversibly done to this character. It's like a mental, like she's snapped.
Yeah, like she's covered in blood. She looks crazy.
I think it's the only ending you can have to this movie. It's a movie that I think is about a society. It's the breakdown of society, and it's also about society that's spinning its wheels. We're stuck in a circle forever. We're always going to do the same thing over and over and over again. We're not going to let go of patterns, and we're going to stick to these like super ingrained cultural patterns and norms. And
yeah, like you have Leatherface literally spinning around in a circle.
Literally impotently spinning in a circle, swinging his chainsaw at nothing. And I think that, yeah, that very famous shot of Leatherface, and like one of my favorite shots in film.
So good.
I think it lends so much credence to the idea that, yeah, this is what this film is kind of trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's an America that is stuck and is just decaying, and it's an America that's eating itself. It's so bleak.
Yeah.
But I love it. It's like my favorite horror movie. And yeah. That was a lot of analysis.
That was a lot. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope this was interesting, especially if you only watch the Kill Count and not the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
Podcast is a different vibe.
Yeah, it is, but it's a valuable one, and one that I'm thankful to you for putting in the work. I couldn't have done all this research. You've been working your ass off.
This has been a hell of an episode to put together. Yeah.
And next week we have another heavily researched,
research-heavy episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're gonna have a guest for that one. That's our trans representation in horror.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited for that one. I'm excited for what our guest has to say about it, because she's also a very big horror fan too. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. That'll be great. We are planning on that coming out on Tuesday as per normal, but if it's a little late like this one, give us some slack.
Yeah.
They're major episodes with a lot of research involved, and Chelsea's been working her ass off. Plus, we had WrestleMania on Sunday.
That's true. WrestleMania took up a lot of time.
Yeah. And Monsterpalooza this weekend. If you're going to be at Monsterpalooza, we'll be there Friday and Saturday. So see us, say hi. We're not mean.
Yeah. We're not going to have like a booth. We're just going to be walking around.
Yeah, we'll just be walking around. But yeah. Cool. Again, I just have to thank you and congratulate you on this awesome episode and all this heavy research. Yeah, I'm very impressed.
Thanks.
And I think Lucy liked it too.
Yeah, cool.
Until next week, you can follow Dead Meat on social media at Dead Meat James on Twitter and Instagram.
And I'm at Carebeck, CREBECC on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want merch, deadmeatstore.com.
Mm-hmm. And shoot us any comments or feedback at deadmeatpod@gmail.com. Mm-hmm. Until next week, I'm James.
I'm Chelsea.
And this has been the Dead Meat Podcast.